This video was made possible by the Eliason Group, an Agile consulting service. You can locate the video under Follow Us, then select Recent Videos on YouTube on the agilenewengland.org website.
I'm just here to welcome Steve. He came to my Scrum Master class in Atlanta. When was that? It was years ago.
2009.
And he said, you know, this is really cool. I'm going to write a book. And he did, and he's had a major impact on the Agile community. The big thing in my company in the last quarter is Scrum at Scale, which is a framework for scaling Scrum across an entire organization, particularly outside of IT. And we just finished a week-long training session for people who are going to do the training. Many of them CSTs, 17 of them, and we're going to do a rolling wave both here in the United States and Europe of that. So if any of you are interested in becoming a coach or a trainer for Scrum at Scale, we'd like to welcome you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Steve will introduce himself, but what's striking for me about Steve is three things. Now, I know that I, like everybody else, gets these surveys from companies that I use, Delta, Bank of America. How do you rate us in a scale of 10? Why? They want to do that because they want to know how they're doing. And that whole technique of doing that is called NPS, Net Promoter Score. I don't know whether Steve invented that stuff, but he definitely was responsible for promoting that for a whole host of places. So I associate Steve with Net Promoter Score. The second thing is I have used a lot of his articles to send to various managers. You know, for those who don't know, Steve writes prolifically for Forbes, and his Forbes blog on Agile and Agility is really great. And if you haven't already checked it out, you must. And the third reason is, this is probably not so very well known, even among many Agilists in the Agile community. Long before he was an Agilist, Steve wrote both in the Harvard Business Review and published a book on business storytelling. So guys, you're in for a great treat tonight, because storytelling, Agile, Agility, what more can I ask for? So please join me in giving a warm Agile and welcome to Steve.
Thanks a lot, and happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm really hoping that it will be a conversation. I don't have a long presentation. I have a few segments, and I thought rather than drone on for a long period, I would talk on a segment or two, and then we'd have some questions, and then we'd talk on some more segments. And most of what I know, I learned initially at Jeff's feet, and that was tremendously insightful. And how did I get there? Well, I was actually born in Sydney, Australia. I go back there whenever I need to, and in fact going back there in a couple of weeks. And they have a number of Agile events this year, and so talking with them. I worked in the World Bank for many years as a manager, and for a long while couldn't figure out why this organization, which was full of brilliant people and had tons of money, had so much difficulty in getting anything done. And eventually, long after I left the World Bank, I found out why. And so I've been writing about that ever since. And the book that I wrote in 2010, after learning from Jeff, was very much about Agile at the team level. There were hints about what was happening in the organization, but it was mainly about the detailed practices of how to actually get things done in a way that is generating more value for the customers with less effort. The writing that I've done since then in Forbes and in the new book is really looking more broadly at how whole organizations are embracing Agile, to quote the title of Jeff's Harvard Business Review article. And that really is exciting when I started talking about Agile with general management types like Gary Hamel and whatnot, and started suggesting that this was really promising and actually solved a lot of problems that hadn't been solved in general management. And I said, look, this really has a huge future. And they sort of scoffed at me and said, that's ridiculous. I mean, your little software team's useless when it comes to running a big organization. There will always be big top-down hierarchies. That's the way it's been since the beginning of time, and that's the way it's going to be. And I said, well, just you wait, and we'll see. And today, when you look at which are the 5 biggest companies on the planet, they are not the big lumbering industrial giants of the 20th century. They happen to be Apple and Amazon and Facebook and Google and Microsoft, basically firms that under different labels are pursuing these ideas and implementing these ideas. So the world has actually become agile, even though it's not always recognized as such, but there are obviously still hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of firms that haven't yet got the message. So we still have work to do, but I think when you're seeing setbacks in individual organizations, we need to recognize that in fact there's been huge progress over the last, since 2001, when these ideas started to see the light of day. And I said that I would talk about from operational agility to strategic agility. So let me begin by saying, well, what am I talking about in terms of operational agility? And this, of course, the starting place, the Agile Manifesto, which is sacred and cannot be touched. And, so I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to rewrite it. I'm not going to suggest to be written. I think it's a historical document and should stay forever in its glory. But at the same time, I have found that when you're trying to explain what these ideas are about to managers, general managers in corporations, it's not always the best document to accomplish that. So I have been giving thought, well, how do you explain Agile in a way that people can more easily understand it? And it needs to have sort of fewer elements. It needs to have elements which are absolutely central, and it needs to have those explained in a way that people can understand them and remember them. And so I have grappled with this morass and looking at all these different labels. That is how I think general managers often look at Agile and say, look, I always knew these people down in the basement were disorganized. Just look at this mess. 40 different labels, fake Agile, Agile in name only. When you guys get your act together, then I'll start to pay attention. And so I started to think, well, what might that look like? And so in some recent articles in Forbes and now in the book, I've suggested that this is a way to explain Agile to people who want to understand what it's about. And that I'm suggesting that it has, it's basically a mindset. It's not a process or a system or a methodology. It's a mindset, a belief system, a way of looking at the world, a way of thinking and acting and interacting in the world. And it has, I'm suggesting, the 3 most important elements are these, and I've called them, to be provocative, I call them laws, core principles, the laws. The law of the customer, probably the most important thing. I think the idea that the purpose of a firm, the only valid purpose of a firm is to create a customer. That's what Peter Drucker said in 1954. He said it again in 73. He said it again in 1985. He must have meant it because he kept saying it. But not all that many people listened to him. But his insight was prescient because there has been this tremendous shift in power in the marketplace from the producer to the consumer. and now the customer is in a sense in charge of the marketplace, and firms that are not constantly, continuously delivering new value to customers are at great risk of not being around all that much longer. And this I've called a Copernican revolution, that the center of the universe, which used to be the commercial center of the universe in the 20th century, used to be the firm. Now the center of the universe is the customer, and the firm is no longer the center. It's on the periphery, fighting with other firms to try to interact with this mercurial element, the customer. And the customer, of course, moves around and changes, so it's not like a static center. These firms are chasing the customers and trying to understand how they can deliver value to the customers. And this is I think, the most important of the principles. It's in direct conflict with the conventional wisdom on Wall Street that the purpose of a firm is to maximize shareholder value as reflected in the stock price. And many, if not most, large organizations still march to that drum, and it leads to all sorts of problems, both for the firm, for the customers, for the economy, and it's a terrible idea. And the law of the customer, I think, is the antidote to it, and it is steadily putting those firms out of business. It is the central principle, and it ties the other pieces of this together. The second is what I called the law of the small team, the idea of this is what the whole Agile movement was really about for the first 10 years after the manifesto, was trying to figure out how you actually got work done in teams. Self-organizing, working in short cycles, getting direct feedback from customers, inspecting and adapting, all of those things that we know and love. In the 2010 book, I had more than 70 different practices reflecting all of that. The new book doesn't talk too much about that. It kind of assumes that those things are there. That is a central part of this, but it needs to be tied together with these other two elements, the law of the customer, and the third element, the fact that the whole organization needs to operate as a fluid, interactive network, not a top-down hierarchy, but a fluid, interactive network where communications are going horizontally and upwards and downwards in all directions. It is a hierarchy of competence, not a hierarchy of authority. And those three elements, to me, summarize the ideas of Agile when you're trying to communicate this to a manager, trying to explain to an organization what this is about. And it's a kind of a shorthand. It obviously doesn't include all the elements of Agile, which is a vast array of know-how at present, and these three principles are simply a summary. But my suggestion is they are a helpful way of communicating the idea of Agile, and I'm hopeful that they are not sacrilege, that they don't offend the Agile Manifesto. They are an attempt to explain the ideas and explain them in a way that makes sense beyond the world of software, because this is now something that's spreading to all parts of organizations and all kinds of organizations. And so that's my effort to communicate this. And I have to say this is my effort, but it's really our effort, because this book and the articles have been prepared and written with the input of many of the people in this room and many other people around the world we tried to write the book in a kind of agile fashion, with sharing the chapters as it was written and getting feedback, wonderful feedback from a whole lot of people, including some of the people in this room. And I tried to learn from that feedback, and it became a much better book as a result of it. But this idea of operational agility makes products and services better, faster, higher quality, cheaper, more personalized, more convenient, operational agility is a wonderful thing. It's the foundation for everything else. It's the foundation for strategic agility. But let me pause here and see whether we're on the same page as to where we're coming from. Is this a reasonable way of thinking about explaining Agile particularly to newcomers and people who haven't been involved in the Agile movement? Is it sacrilege? Is it oversimplification? Is it wrong to call these things laws? I'm open to suggestion. Silence. Yeah. I'll go at the back and then we'll come here.
I particularly like the fact that you're talking about a customer, because I think oftentimes in the goal to become agile, we forget that we're doing this for someone, and it's the customer. So I think that piece particularly I find very powerful, and I believe it could be a law. So that would be cool.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes say that there is no such thing as a B2B corporation, a business-to-business corporation. There is only B2C. There is only an organization that's providing value to other human beings, and you need to understand the organization in those terms. That if you're only thinking about providing value to another corporation, then you may well be being led astray. You had a question.
One of the things you listed was that corporations' main focus shouldn't be generating revenue for the shareholders.
Not
I'm
exactly.
not saying I disagree.
No, that's not what I said, but
What?
that's not exactly what I said. But
Sorry. But that's rather a hard sell at some companies. Would it be sufficient to say that the means to do that was by focusing on customer satisfaction? In other words, the goal is, make money, but doing so by focusing on customer needs.
that's exactly what I'm trying
Okay.
inarticulately to say.
I'm just withdrawing.
And that making money for shareholders in the long term is obviously crucial. If the firm doesn't make money for its shareholders, it goes out of business. And I'll be hammering that point even much more dramatically in just a moment. This is not about ignoring the shareholders, but what we've seen systematically over the last 50 years, that if you focus on generating value for customers, you make a great deal of money for the shareholders. And the 5 biggest firms in the world are the 5 biggest firms because they have been dramatically providing value for their customers, and as a result they generate huge value in the stock market. So this is using customer value as a means to generate value for customers. It's certainly not ignoring the shareholders. What we've seen is that when you focus on generating value for shareholders, particularly shareholders in the short run, and particularly the stock price, and you compensate executives with shares and stock options, then you find that the corporation suffers. The corporation doesn't do well. The corporation starts to become a money-making machine which isn't adding value either to the shareholders or society, and ultimately goes out of business. And although that death spiral can take a very long time as a result of financial engineering of various kinds, share buybacks and a whole lot of other gadgets which can enable these firms to stagger on even though they're not generating any value for society. So it's not about ignoring shareholders, it's about getting the relationship right. You have a question? Let's take it from this side. Do we have another microphone?
Over here? Yeah, so you go back to the previous slide where you showed the things that I have a question about.
Okay.
Yeah, that. So the two questions about the purpose of the firm is to create a customer versus like serving a customer, like creating a customer out of thin air or what?
That is the language of Peter Drucker.
Okay.
There is only one valid purpose of a firm, is to create a customer. And it's not exactly the most elegant or transparent of language, but it does convey the point that this is about creating new customers. It's not just servicing existing customers. It's about generating new value. It's about, I've often spoken about delighting customers, that you're really generating an interactive relationship with customers. And so it's Peter Drucker's language, but there are many other formulations of it.
And how does this, I'm trying to, in my mind, okay, so these are 3, and there's 4 principles. Is there some sort of relationship, or this is just your thinking? Like there's definitely a customer in the 4 principles. So does this relate at all? These sound really good. It's a little confusing to have 4 principles and 3 lines. I don't know how they relate to each other.
Well, the goal of the law of the customer is the driver. This is the driving force of the whole set of activities. The second law is really the mechanics of how that is accomplished. And the third is the linchpin that ties the pieces together. What we've seen, I think I've seen quite a lot, so we looked at organizations over the last 8 years, and organizations, the learning organization, and see what happens. That the idea that if you put agile teams, you made teams agile in an organization, and you had enough agile teams in the organization, then the whole organization would become agile. And I think what we've seen is that that isn't the case, that you have to go beyond making the teams agile. You have to have the whole organization really operating in a different way. And if you put agile teams into a top-down bureaucracy, only one of those two can survive. Either the bureaucracy will crush the agile teams, or the agile teams will take over the organization. And hopefully it's the latter, but I think one needs to recognize that that is a core element of making this happen. Simply making teams agile is not going to get the job done. I know there are more questions, but let me move on. We can come back to the questions. And let me move on to strategic agility, which is an idea and a phrase that I've introduced again in Forbes articles and again in the book. And what is this? Well, let me explain parts of it by a story. In 2004, in Helsinki, Finland, a team of people made a presentation to the senior management of Nokia. Nokia was then a manufacturer of mobile phones. It was the most successful manufacturer of mobile phones. It was making more money than any of the other people making mobile phones, and in that sense it was very successful. There was a great deal of competition, but they were the most successful maker of mobile phones. And their phones had a familiar look. They had keyboards, they had tiny screens, and they were basically a phone. And the team in their presentation were part of a larger effort within Nokia to figure out what the office of the future would look like. And in fact, it was a brilliant vision of the office of the future, and many of the things that have happened in the last 14 years were pictured in that Nokia vision of what the future would look like. And one of the things in that vision was, why don't we make a different kind of a phone? Why don't we have a big screen on this phone? Why don't we have the keyboard not a separate keyboard of buttons? Why don't we get rid of all those buttons and have a screen that you could type on? And why don't we make this not just a phone, but something that could connect to the internet, and maybe it could do other things. It sounds like a pretty interesting idea. Why don't we give this a try? And the senior management of Nokia, who were making a lot of money from their, relatively a large amount of money from their existing phone, said, well, look, it's an interesting idea, but would it really work? Could it be done? We don't even know. It isn't tested, hasn't been tried. It would take a huge amount of money, and it would be very risky. And what's more, it would cannibalize our existing market. So, yes, let's keep pursuing this, but not very energetically. Let's put it on a back burner. Let's not give it very much resources, and we'll eventually get around to it, but it's not going to be the big new thing of Nokia. And so that, by and large, is what happened. And for the next 3 years, Nokia continued to make their keyboard phone with a little screen, and it was still successful. But then in 2007, boom, Apple showed up with exactly the thing that the team had presented to Nokia management in 2004. And of course, it was a lot more than a phone. It was an internet device. It had the capability to do all sorts of other things, and it basically wiped out Nokia. The market, it generated a whole vast new market, not just the people who are existing users of phones. I mean, in 2007, I didn't even have a mobile phone. I didn't want a mobile phone, but once the iPhone was around, I had to have it. And I, like hundreds of millions of other people in the world, just had to have it. And so it created a new market. And this is what strategic agility is about, creating a market that turns non-customers like me into customers, that turn people who didn't want the product the way it was, and created the desire to have this new product. And that is what strategic agility is about. Business creating innovations, new businesses, market creating innovations that bring in new customers. And these are important because they have the potential to be much more profitable than simply making the existing product better. When you were looking at the firms like Nokia and BlackBerry and the firms that were competing with existing mobile phones, and they were all making their phones better, but they didn't get much more profit from making their phones better, even though they steadily got better. It was by doing something completely different that actually generated the huge resources, and Apple became the most profitable firm on the planet, and is now still the most valuable firm on the planet by market creating innovation. And this is what, and Nokia was devastated. So it is true that the Nokia and the executives made money from 2004 to 2007, but then they were fired and 25,000 people lost their jobs, and Nokia was devastated by the thing. And this is one way of kind of depicting what this is about. Nokia was focusing on its existing customers, making the phone better for its existing customers, and was not paying too much attention to the possibility of getting new customers, and thinking through, if we could bring all these new customers into the picture, we could actually make a whole lot more money, because there are a lot more people out there that are not currently customers. And this is what Apple did so brilliantly. So operational agility, about making things better, faster, cheaper, existing customers. Strategic agility, about market creating innovation that brings in new customers. So when I look around the Agile world and the firms implementing Agile, what I see mostly is operational agility, work that's making products better, faster, cheaper, more personalized, more colorful, more convenient, whatever. There's much less attention, energy being put on these much more profitable ideas of strategic agility. I'll say a little bit more shortly about how to do that. Some examples of what I mean by market-creating innovation in mobile phones was this shift from a keyboard, tiny screen phone to the iPad. Not just a phone, but a multifunctional device. If you think about it, it's not just making a better candle, it's about a different way of generating light, a light bulb to generate light, not just a better candle. Or as Henry Ford said, if he'd asked his customers what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. And instead, he provided not a faster horse, which would have had a tiny market, some market, but a tiny market, but there was a huge market for a new way of transportation, the Model T Ford. And Amazon, brilliant exponent of strategic agility. It began as a retailer of books and then all kinds of products, and now moving into all sorts of different fields. Amazon Web Services, it's Echo, and each day you open the newspaper, there's some new business that Amazon is creating. So they are demonstrating strategic agility. Netflix began renting DVDs and then shifted into streaming video, and now they're producing videos. Another striking example of strategic agility. And what you saw in the 20th century was that firms had great difficulty with strategic agility. Once you were in one business, it seemed very hard. There were hardly any examples of firms that had this kind of capability. But once digital capability, software entered the world, then if you were really good at Amazon, at retailing vast quantities of products and able to deliver them, then it wasn't such a huge leap to jump to web services. So once the firm has mastered digital, it becomes much more feasible to shift from one business to another. But you didn't see that much in the 20th century. You also see some of these giants which have been very successful, but not necessarily showing all that much strategic agility so far. I mean, there was this quip that Google's an ad company with a bunch of hobbies, and it has search and AdWords, and it's bought some businesses to add on, like YouTube and Android, which it got from outside, but it has a lot of things it's working on, a lot of businesses working on, but we haven't really seen much in the way of outcome as compared to, say, Amazon. So the fact that they are big and very innovative in the operational sense. I mean, they've made great strides in their operational agility, but still working on their strategic agility. So this is going beyond just adding value for your customers and thinking about non-customers, thinking about the people who are not currently customers. How could you bring them into the picture? What could you do that would turn them into customers? A couple of things that this is not about. It's not about the distinction between exploring and exploiting. I often hear people say, I know what you're talking about. This is explore and exploit. You're talking about exploring, and this, you add an explore element to the exploiting the existing businesses. No, Agile is really about exploring both operational and the new business. So it's not about this distinction between exploring and exploiting. Agile is about improving value in all parts of the business. And it's not about the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness. Operational agility is also about both efficiency and effectiveness. So there's, it does seem some difficulty in kind of grasping what this idea of market-creating innovation is about, and I'm trying to explore ways of making it clearer. But let me pause here again and take some questions. Yeah.
The question I have is that maybe you say something about the what you see as a connection between vision and strategic agility, and also there are a lot of times there might be the have and the have nots, and a lot of the companies who have a lot of cash might have the luxury of doing vision, maybe have a CTO that would be able to explore and then put bets on more far away vision, and some company might not. So also in the sense of balancing how to pay bills.
Well, there's a tangle of questions here, and it's an area where there's a whole lot of BS talked, and people talking about visions and talking about the firm must have a purpose, and I'm not the only one to say there's a lot of BS. Andrew Hill in the Financial Times has talked quite eloquently about how firms that talk big about their purpose and their vision for the future, often it's not much more than BS. What is important is that the firm does think through what is happening with its existing business, what new businesses it could open up, and to develop, you might say, a portfolio of activities that are robust and viable so that they don't end up like Nokia being blown out of the water. And Nokia, in retrospect, should have actually pursued the iPhone lookalike, and that should have, it was on their agenda, and they had laid out what it would look like. They did have a kind of a vision, but they never got round to implementing the vision. And so getting clear on where what is the current situation they're in, what are the possibilities, and actually getting on with it. You'll see a lot of firms right now have huge amounts of spare cash. What are they doing with it? Are they spending it on new investments? Well, one study showed that $6 billion was being spent on improving salaries for workers, and $176 billion was being shunted back to shareholders, simply paid to shareholders. So it's not obvious that these large financial resources are actually being spent on new businesses and creating new value, whereas a firm like Amazon is putting almost all of its resources into new investments, and for a long period didn't even make any profit, as it was so focused on investing in creating new business. So it's a tangled area. Strategic agility is not vision, it's simply the aspect of creating new businesses. A firm could decide that if it's in a very stable sector, that it doesn't need to create new businesses. But it's getting harder and harder to find areas where where you have a stable sector. Most businesses are now subject to disruption. Let's take a, yeah.
The concern that kind of echoing back, like I sometimes have remembered the business school models in the late 20th century, which are practically all things to all people, conglomerates and the like.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't get very far.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always something that a particular firm is good at doing.
Mm-hmm.
So a software firm is good at that and is not particularly good in building hotels and running them, say. Now, there are some exceptions, because you talked about Amazon and Google, but for the most part, a firm is expert in what it does, and even Nokia, had it made the change, would still be in what it does. Apple stayed within what it does, and so did Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, in doing strategic agile, at least for us,
Mm-hmm.
to figure out what exactly is that for a company that is involved in software and information systems to be agile in ways that a fashion industry or a hotel chain or an airline or a dry cleaning conglomerate would not be. That is, how do we focus on our field, software, because I'm looking at all things to all people. Well, maybe not all things, sure, but to all. So some things to all people. Some things being the things that we can do well, but then make it to all people. I see that as probably the way to go. I guess the question is, how do we get strategic agility out when what we're involved with is software and information systems? That's our profession. How do we keep it to that and not spread all this thin?
Well, one could say that software is eating the world, and all firms are software companies. And in fact, much of their value comes from what they're doing in software. So I would tend to be looking at all companies as being, to some extent, software companies, and I see their future as very much dependent on becoming agile, more and more agile operationally, and to have the capability where appropriate for strategic agility, to be able, if there is a capability in the firm, and if it makes sense business-wise, to be able to move into new businesses. And as I say, you're right to say that in the 20th century, firms tended to be in the business they were in, and that was that. And efforts to get beyond the core were generally unsuccessful. But now what you're seeing, because things are much more flexible with software being so central, once the firm gets very good at handling large data and software, a shift from one area to another doesn't seem like the kind of stretch that it was in the 20th century. So it's becoming much more feasible, and but the firm does have to take into account what it's capable of. And if it starts to enter businesses where it doesn't have the capability, it will fall on its face, and it needs to stop right away and go back to its knitting perhaps and get its act together on what it started out doing. But it is rather risky for a firm these days to be thinking, well, I'm in this sector, this business, this area, and if I do work hard and keep my nose to the grindstone, I will be rewarded. That is not necessarily the case. I mean, paradoxically, Nokia began as a wood pulp firm back in the 19th century and ended up making galoshes, Wellington boots, and eventually got into cable and then networks, and it was only in the late 20th century where they started to get into something like mobile phones. So Nokia paradoxically had a long history of strategic agility, but when it came to the crunch in 2004, they missed that particular call. You've been trying to ask a question for a long while.
Do you have any thoughts about directions for strategic agility on the part of a major research university? What, for instance, might Harvard do that is strategically agile?
Well, I'm thinking more about commercial firms, and my sense is that Harvard probably has enough on its hands with its existing research agenda. The idea of strategic agility is to defend against disruption. I mean, it's unlikely that Harvard is going to face significant disruption in its research activities, at least. In some areas it may. But I wouldn't be recommending, I haven't recommended this as a remedy for their research agenda.
I mean, as you probably know, an institution like Harvard is actually in several businesses. One is teaching students, another is doing research that's funded, another is, sort of basic research, just advancing knowledge. And I guess I suspect that the teaching students part is perhaps in some jeopardy.
So the faculty that I talk to is the sense that they're not subject to disruption. I mean, I was listening to a professor just last week, and they were saying, I know exactly how many students will come to my class. I know exactly the profile they will have. I know exactly what my course will look like. And I see this heading out into the distant future. Now, Harvard or Columbia or wherever it is may have the prestige to be able to do that, but not, you're right to say that many other, particularly the business schools, are faced with a very different and more uncertain future, and they certainly need to be thinking about change. Let's move on and we can come back to some of these questions. Why is strategic agility important? Well, one is that it protects, it's a potential insurance policy against disruption, and Nokia was the case that I gave of that. A second reason is that, as I've hinted before, operational agility may not necessarily make all that much money. The assumption, many of the people in the Agile world, is if I keep doing good work and keep doing better work and making the products and services better, then I will be rewarded and my firm will be rewarded and things will work out. Now, those assumptions have often proven incorrect because the world has changed. It used to be the case, but the world has changed, and there's been this power shift from seller to buyer, and the greater competition in the marketplace means that often improvements can't be monetized. The costs of improving the product can't be monetized, and the customer is able to insist on the product or service at a lower cost. So the competitive pressure is much greater. So simply making your existing product better through operational agility has often been a disappointment. And that, I think, lies behind some of the setbacks that you see firms that appear to be embracing Agile, and then suddenly there's a convulsion and you look around and the whole support of Agile has vanished. In these more competitive times where firms are fighting over a limited number of customers, which being called the red oceans, bloody red oceans of fierce competition, it's difficult for firms, any firm in that bloody red ocean, to make much money. The major financial gains come from market-creating innovations, the so-called blue oceans, market-creating innovation. And if you can create a blue ocean where there is no competition, or get ahead of the competition, as Apple did, the possibility of making a great deal of money, a humongous amount of money, becomes possible. So in mobile phones, Nokia was making some money, but compared to what eventually was made, not a great deal. But none of the firms were making very much money, even though they were steadily improving their mobile phones. They were in the bloody red oceans. And Apple said, let's think different. They took out some of the key features of a phone. And this is an interesting aspect of strategic agility, that it's often removing something that customers highly value. Like many customers still, the BlackBerry customers still languish and yearn for their keyboard. This was something that was very close to them. But Apple said, I'm going to take it away. I'm going to take away your buttons, and added some features, large screen, internet apps, and it was cool. And bingo, it was a whole new world, and everyone had to have it. And now the most valuable firm on the planet, maybe less than Amazon. I think Amazon just nipped them recently. So this is this shift from focusing on the existing customers to these vast numbers of new customers. So let me take a few questions on these.
So how do you recommend an existing company devise some strategic initiatives away from their existing culture? I feel like it can be challenging for a company with an existing culture to take on this new level of risk and unknown. And how do you pitch it to the organization?
I mean, Agile in itself, going from a bureaucracy to operational agility is, for most organizations, is a huge cultural shift in itself. And so that's a big leap and takes years. And one is not talking about weeks or months, you're talking about years, particularly in a large organization, to get that kind of thing. And strategic agility is another step beyond that. And it requires even more effort. And there is a whole chapter in the book describing the efforts of Kurt Carlson, who was the CEO of SRI International, a Stanford research organization, which he was CEO of them from 1998 to 2014. And in that period, they generated a whole slew of strategic innovations, market-creating innovations. The most famous of them was Siri, the gadget on the iPhone, which was invented in SRI and sold to Apple. But they had many other, and he describes in graphic detail how that happened. When he arrived in 1998, SRI was basically bankrupt. They were about to be put out of their misery. And he spent every day just talking to people about the need to create value for customers. Every conversation, every interaction was related to his creating what he called value propositions, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But that chapter gives a great deal of the feel of what it's like to be leading a cultural change, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of effort, and there's initially a lot of opposition, and one person can't do it. It needs a whole group of people to undertake it. So, yeah?
Picking up on that last, from that last question, the whole question about the uncertainty and kind of upcoming activities, I'm just wondering what's the right kind of language to use to respond to somebody who says, well, what's your budget for the coming year? Mm-hmm. And I know about the budgeting, the beyond budgeting movement. I'm not too familiar with exactly how they lay that out. I know there's something that tries to answer that, but it's the kind of, how do you answer not only the trolls from accounting, the way Scott Adams puts it, but also the people who are saying, hey, I need to put something down for what your budget's going to be for the next year. I got no clue, because we're going to be exploring.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see bureaucracies and traditionally managed firms create this illusion of certainty. And they say, here's my plan, and here's my budget, and here is what we will spend, and here's what it will generate, and here will be my profits. And they put this out, and it's, as one of the first Agilists was a Prussian general, Helmut von Moltke in the 1860s, who came up with the famous statement, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And that is also true of most corporate plans, that they don't survive the first contact with the customer. And these elaborate plans are illusions that are concocted. They might make the managers feel happy, but they don't represent the reality. So what the beyond budgeting and people who are applying Agile techniques to budgeting is to realize that it needs to be a rolling plan, and it needs to be continuously updated, and having annual budgets doesn't make much sense. It should be just a continuously rolling forward, and as you learn, you adjust what you're going to spend, and you continuously review what's going on, what's happening to your existing business, what's happening to these future ideas that you have, how are they coming along, are they going to come on board on time, and you don't have that as a plan, but you have a set of options, and you manage it as a set of options. And so there's a whole different mindset that has to enter in the finance department and the legal department to enable all that to happen. Yeah.
So building on the last two questions, do you see a correlation between the ability of an organization to use strategic agility and growth, in the sense that, as we know, history always repeats itself? You see organizations that grow and become, ginormous, and then they plateau and fall. Going to the example of Nokia at the time when they were the biggest, they had nothing else, and though they were cash rich, they still were not exploring new territory. And I think the same can be said of large companies that are large today, that plateau.
Right, as I say, a lot of them don't have anything better to do but give the money back to their shareholders. But you also, and you can see some of these big firms, the 5 big firms I mentioned, which do appear to be plateauing. I mean, Facebook, not obvious that they are doing much in strategic agility. Google, I've mentioned, the same category. Amazon is a contrast, where they continuously opening new opportunities. But so firms do plateau, and if they don't get better at strategic agility, they will plateau. Some of the firms have become monopolies. I mean, Google is basically a duopoly, a dual monopoly. And it will run into antitrust problems if it doesn't do something. It will either fix it itself or it will have it fixed by the government. So there are other ways in which these, when the firms get really big, how they are plateaued by external forces. But some of them are plateaued by lack of energy and lack of insight, lack of inspiration, lack of innovation within the firm. But that's not the problem for most. I mean, the external limits are not the problem for most firms. Most firms, the problem is that they are still being run in a bureaucratic, top-down command and control fashion, and are unable to implement even operational agility, let alone strategic agility. Let me just have a few more slides, and then we can do all questions. Why does strategic agility need special attention? Well, there are these 5 reasons why simply having teams implement the well-known agile practices doesn't really lead to these market-creating innovations. The teams tend to focus on existing customers. They hesitate to eliminate features, particularly features which are loved by customers. And imagining BlackBerry removing its keyboard. I mean, it was just unthinkable that they could remove something that was so loved by their customers. And cannibalizing existing products. It was a very hard decision on Apple to cannibalize the iPod with the iPhone. They eventually did, but it wasn't easy. And these incentives for C-suite executives are all to make money in the short run, to have quick wins, early wins, and some of these strategic initiatives are going to take a number of years to pan out, and so as you look around, you see these big bets morph into small bets, and the firm isn't able to put together the investment that's needed for these things. So there are a lot of reasons why simply carrying on with Agile as we know and love it, to think that it will lead to strategic agility. It's not that it can't happen, and I have written about Discover Weekly at Spotify, which does appear to be a genuine example where this amazingly successful innovation, Discover Weekly, generated millions and tens of millions of new users. It became almost a brand in itself, and it was generated by a small Agile team without support from the top. The top was actually quite skeptical whether it was a good idea. It was only by, they kind of marketed internally within Spotify with the staff in the dark of night and without, and then people within Spotify say, hey, what's this thing that's got into my iPhone? Where did it come from? So by the time the top management found out about it, they already had enough data to show that it was a brilliant success. So it was supported, but that was a very unusual thing. I've been searching for examples like this, and this is one of the very few examples that I found. If you have other examples where teams have come up with strategic initiatives like this, I'd love to hear about them, because they're scarcer than hen's teeth, I think, at this stage. And what I'm suggesting is that making these things happen requires some additional elements which haven't been part of the standard Agile playbook. And it's not something I invented, but something that Kurt Carlson at SRI International wrote a wonderful book about it in 2006, and actually went ahead and implemented it and generated a whole stack of market-creating innovations. And it's a set of fairly simple ideas with this mnemonic NABC. And it's about getting clear on the need for what you're doing before you ever spend any money on it, getting clear on the approach to the ecology that you're going to will enable you to prosper in meeting this need, the benefits both for you and for the customer and the competition. And working through these elements was what Kurt did on a daily basis with everyone he talked to. He would ask them, what is your value proposition? What is your NABC proposition that you're working on? Tell me what it is. And they rehearsed these things over and over again. And the Siri, for instance, they spent 3 years discussing what this value proposition was before they ever spent a cent on actually building the thing. They wanted to get clear on what it was they were doing, and could it actually make money? How would it make money? And that for several years wasn't clear to them how that was all going to fit together. And so there are these four elements. Then the most important is getting crystal clear on what is the unmet need that you are trying to meet and how large is it. Many market creating innovations fail because they couldn't even if they're wildly successful, couldn't be large enough to make the kind of money, have the kind of success that the firm is hoping to make. If you're a large firm, you're going to need to have a large success, and many of the innovative ideas that come along are simply not large enough. So you need to think through in advance, what is the unmet need and how large is it? And secondly, what is the unique approach to the ecology to meet that need? How will your firm meet that need in a way that will make it special, that will be difficult for another firm to meet the need in the same way? And then thinking through what are the benefits both to the firm itself and the customer if this need was actually met by this approach. And then the competition, how do competitors meet the same need? And recognizing that the biggest competition is almost always the customer doing nothing. The customer simply doing what they're currently doing, muddling through their life in the way they're muddling, and that doesn't involve any new investment, and that is often the killer competitor to strategic innovations like this, the customer simply isn't prepared to make the effort to change their life to enable it to happen. So thinking through those 4 elements, I think, is the best set of steps that I've come across, and the chapter in the book lays out in a lot more detail what is involved in meeting each of these steps. So if you want to go beyond operational agility, there are ways that have had a certain amount of success, that playbooks, a set of steps that can enable you to think through what would be involved in doing this. And I think increasingly what we're seeing is that operational agility is not a bad thing. It's an essential thing for surviving, and it's the foundation for the rest. If you really want to thrive, if you really want to have a business that's booming on a large scale, then strategic agility is something you should be giving some thought to. And so those are the things that the book is about. It's about the 3 laws of Agile. It's about creating an Agile culture, understanding what's involved in strategic agility, and the headwinds facing Agile is different goals. The goal of the firm to maximize shareholder value directly in conflict with the goals of Agile, the most important headwind, if you like, I think, on Agile, and often the reason why support for Agile transformations, even successful transformation, is abruptly pulled. It's because of this that the firm is actually heading in a different direction, and they give lip service to Agile, they support Agile for a period, but when push comes to shove, they favor what the stock market is pushing for. And share buybacks are a mechanism to do that, offshoring often the same way, and a backward-looking strategy, a whole section, 4 chapters on these headwinds which stand in the way of successful Agile implementations. So that's what the book is about. Other shameless plugs, Business Utility Conference a couple of weeks in New York. It was a terrific event last year, and worth looking into if you haven't already signed up. SD Learning Consortium is something that I launched a couple of years ago, and it's a group of firms, some of them in the Boston area, which are learning from each other about how this whole set of whole Agile movement, what works, what doesn't work, and a setting in which no one is selling anything, no one is bullshitting the others. People are sharing their problems in an open environment. So if you're in a firm that is interested in getting involved in such a consortium, let me know. I'll be happy to talk about it. It's open to any firm that's really interested in sharing openly what is working and what isn't working in the Agile movement. So that's the presentation. Happy to take the rest of the questions that you have.
I have a question, which is, given that you started your talk with the challenges of explaining Agile, what is the advantage of referring to this as strategic agility versus an innovation strategy?
What is the advantage of?
What's the value of referring to this sort of, what I have seen otherwise explained as sort of your innovation strategy, so referring to this now as strategic agility?
Well, it's a particular kind of innovation. Operational innovation is making the existing product better and quicker and faster and more personalized. That's very important innovation, but it's making the existing product better for the existing customers. This is about drawing in new customers. And so what I'm suggesting is that it's qualitatively different. It has a very different potential effect, as potentially much more profitable, and it requires a different approach from innovation related to making the existing product better for existing customers. For operational innovation, you talk to the existing customers, you find out where their pain points are, you fix those pain points, and then what are the remaining? You keep working down the list of you know who you're dealing with. In strategic agility, you're dealing with people you don't know, people you've never met, people who are not currently having any interaction, and you're having to figure out what would it take to get those people involved. So it's a qualitatively different kind of thing. I'm suggesting at least it's worth a look as something qualitatively different. Yeah.
In today's world, where a lot of people will start thinking the notion of innovation might belong to the architects and the people in the CTO, like the 1% of a company sometimes. And so when you start thinking about strategic agility, you want to deploy this the way you want to deploy operational agility, where the push is from the bottom or the middle out. How would you see a way of implementing or make this become successfully deployed around the world?
Well, I argue in the book that the ideas should come from anywhere, and the firm should organize itself so that the ideas can come from anywhere, so that the kind of innovation that happened in Spotify with Discover Weekly, that should be normal. And it describes how SRI, under Kurt Carlson, actually operated in that way. And he, as I say, every day he would have lunch with different people and he would quiz them. What is your value proposition? What is your idea? Tell me about it. Tell me what is the need that you're going to meet. And that over a period of years, I mean, people realized this was the most important thing for the top management. He was supported by another other group that were continually pushing and asking and pulling from the staff. What are the ideas that we need? We need big ideas. What are they? And so it's a very different environment from traditional strategic planning, which is basically a front to enable the top management to stay in charge and prevent anyone else from having any say in the future. This has to be the exact opposite. It has to be, yeah, huge. And the book describes what that's like and what's involved in making it happen. Yeah.
If I'm not a CEO or even close to it, how do I move this ahead?
Share my book with your CEO. And the book is intended to be written by managers and to a calling card for staff, so you can say, look, you want to understand what this is about, here's something that might be helpful to you. And talk to your colleagues, talk to form a coalition. I mean, when I was in the World Bank and trying to launch a strategic change in the organization when I didn't have a job, I mean, it was basically talking to colleagues, using the power of leadership storytelling, about which I wrote some books, to inspire people. Look, this is an obvious idea. We have to do it. The passion that you had for the idea is what generates energy, and eventually that idea percolated up the chain of the management, and the president of the World Bank heard about it, and to the great horror of the Centurion Guards surrounding him, he said, right, let's do it. And the next 4 years, a whole set of battles and struggles as to whether and how we were going to implement the idea, but it did actually get implemented. But ideas rarely start at the top or from the very bottom. It's this middle part of the organization where people have enough understanding of how the whole organization works, but they're not right at the top, so they're not part of the Centurion Guards, but they're not totally at the bottom either, so they have a little bit of, and they have enough smarts and social capital so that they can start to put together coalitions to make this happen. So these things don't happen in a very linear, organized, structured way. This is about mobilizing energy and passion with anyone you can find to make it happen in your organization.
So I've heard about playbooks, innovation playbooks, and I've heard about passionate storytelling. What other essential prerequisites do you see as being critical to the transition, making the transition successfully from operational to strategic agility?
Well, I mean, courage, smarts, tact, being clever about when to speak and when not to speak, when to move, when to pull back. I mean, this a whole array of skills involved in being educated about what it is you're trying to do and learning from others and forming coalitions. All of those things are a huge number of elements woven together to make it happen.
I'll ask you questions. I'm curious how lean startup would fit into your view of strategic agility. Is that a legitimate approach to trying to achieve that?
Yeah. Lean startup is related in some ways to Kurt Carlson's NABC playbook. It has a few slight differences. One of the mantras of lean startup is fail fast. Kurt says that is the dumbest idea in the world. Has a lot of competition, but he says that's the dumbest. You want to learn fast. You do not want to fail, slow or fast. That should not be your goal in life, to fail fast, fail slow, fail anyway. You should be trying to succeed, and you should be learning. So that's one, the emphasis on succeeding. And the second thing is the emphasis in lean startup, at least in some of the early iterations, was let's do something really rapidly, something let's throw up a website and find out whether people, that might work for a tiny startup. But if you're thinking about a serious major innovation for a significant corporation, you have to be a bit more serious and Kurt would be arguing you need to think through, is this idea, even if successful, could it work? A lot of the ideas that come up pursued by organizations are stillborn. In other words, they couldn't be successful even if they wouldn't be a success even if they were implemented exactly as planned, because they're not large enough or they don't have the legs to make happen. And so it is thinking through carefully before you actually launch into action. Say, Siri spent 3 years talking about it before they actually implement it, whereas I get the sense that in lean startup you would have rushed into something. And I mean, SRI in the previous regime had done a lot of that rushing into things, and a lot of them came to nothing. And so they decided that they really need to stop and think before you act. And there is, in fact, an anti-lean startup movement, I'm told, which is specifically related to big innovations, which are going to involve significant investment, and for which the lean startup approach is not perhaps the most ideal to do it. But they both have their supporters, and they both have their champions, but they may be. It may be that the NABC is more appropriate to large-scale innovations where you're really trying to change the world in a major way. Lean startup is very good for startups and small startups and trying to get something underway.
Thank you, Steve.